Well, if everybody's all set in terms of coffee and food, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Chris. So with this morning, thank you, and thank you. It's September, starting our the fall season of men's breakfast. Well, we were here in August too, but it's good to see everybody here. And Crosby's once again very graciously offered to sponsor the men's breakfast with the groceries for the program. So we appreciate that. And we've got Chris Comiskey who is president of the Georgetown Historical Society, and she's graciously agreed to come and talk about the abolitionist movement in Georgetown. So I thought that would be an interesting topic, and certainly look forward to hearing more about it. Next month, men's breakfast will be Thursday, October 11th, because I have to go to a conference the first Thursday of the month. So that we'll go to the next week, and then in November we'll be back to normal. But I've already talked to Jason Abasher from the Essex County Sheriff's Department, and we know Jason through Triad, but Jason is also an attorney. He's an elder attorney, so he's going to come next month, Thursday, October 11th, and talk with us about healthcare proxies, durable power of attorney, and other elder law issues. So I was glad to get him. He's very good, a lot of fun. But this month we're very glad that you can come. That's it. Thank you for being gracious about it.
Okay.
We're glad to have you. So I'm going to start to clean up, but we have more coffee. If anybody needs anything else, just let me know, and I'll quietly just.
Well, hi guys.
Good morning.
Nice to be here with you guys this morning. I wear a couple of historical hats in town, actually, along with being president of the Georgetown Historical Society. I'm also the historian of First Congregational Church, and some of the things that I'll talk about today come directly from church records. And in fact, looking through church records, I learned about this particular movement in town. Now, of course, you've all heard about the abolitionists. Everybody knows about the abolitionists, right? The groups out to stop slavery, and a lot is known about that. But there's this group of abolitionists that seem to have been forgotten. And they were called the Come-Outers. The Come-Outers were a more radical group, and we had some right in town, and they were causing a lot of problems. And so I thought I'd talk about this particular radical group today that most people don't know about. Around the
It's more than 8:15. I'm sorry. I just became a grandfather for the first night.
More nervous the better. Spending money, pal.
I like those interruptions. Those are fun. During the mid-1800s, most of the men in Georgetown were either farmers or worked in the shoe industry. Most of them attended church. Church was a very important part of people's life back then, both socially and religiously. Then along came the abolitionist movement and stirred things up. The New England Anti-Slavery Society was formed in the 1830s, and at their convention in 1837, there was a resolution proposed by William Lloyd Garrison, probably heard of him, right? And this resolution was passed urging the abolitionists to leave unresponsive churches and come out from among them and separate. And those who decided to do so were called Come-Outers. Now, as you can imagine, urging people to leave their churches was a kind of controversial idea. Some of the abolitionists felt the churches around New England were not doing enough to stop slavery. They felt they should be more actively involved. And if they weren't, then these people should just leave the church and turn their backs on it. At the First Congregational Church, which at that time was located on the corner of Elm and East Main Streets, right across from the Brocklebank Museum, the congregation appeared to be in favor of abolishing slavery. It wouldn't appear that it would be one of those unresponsive churches at all. In January of 1840, they passed a resolution. Put my glasses on so I can read it well. This is in 1840. It was resolved that we, as a branch of Christ's Church, feel ourselves called upon to bear a united and solemn testimony against this sin in all its forms, feeling that in neglect of this duty, we at the last day shall incur the displeasure of him who has said, inasmuch as ye did it not to the least of these my brethren, ye did it not to me. And that it is a Christian duty which we owe to the oppressor, thus faithfully to reprove him for his reasons doing sin. Resolved that in the light that is thus upon the path of the Christian at the present day, it is a sin for us as a church, and we will not hold fellowship or communion with anyone who claims the right to or holds his fellow beings as property. Resolved that we feel it to be a sin and a reproach to the cause of Christ for anyone bearing a name to continue at or apologize for the sin of American slavery. Now that doesn't sound like an unresponsive church, does it? It sounds like they're getting right out there and saying it's a sin. We're not going to take communion or associate with people who feel it's okay to hold slaves. However, that wasn't good enough for the come-outers. Apparently, they wanted them to be even more actively involved. Now, the anti-slavery movement here in Georgetown seemed to particularly really catch fire around 1841. At that time, there was an abolitionist named Stephen Foster. He was fairly famous at the time. He did a lot of speaking, went to a lot of speaking engagements, but it was very controversial. The idea of abolition back then was a controversial idea. A lot of people were not in favor of it for economic reasons and such. So even though in our day and age it seems like an obvious good thing, back then it wasn't so obvious. So anyhow, in 1841, this Stephen Foster was speaking in Danvers, and he was arrested, and he was jailed. And he wrote to a friend of his in Georgetown, who's named Theodore Eliot, and asked for his help. So Theodore Eliot, along with another man from Georgetown named Moses Wright, who were very, very active in the Anti-Slavery Society, went down to Danvers and paid his bail and freed him and brought him back to town. And this comes from a newspaper telling about that particular time when they brought him back. Mr. Eliot and Wright gave the required bond and took Mr. Foster in their old two-wheeled chaise and started for Georgetown. But before they reached the town, the news of Mr. Foster's arrest and release had spread about the town, so that when the royal party arrived at the residence of Mr. Eliot, a large crowd of people had gathered about the public square. As soon as the party had partaken of refreshments, a platform was erected made of boxes and boards. Upon this improvised platform, Mr. Foster took his position, and after offering a short but impressive prayer, he commenced an address that continued for 2 hours and more. In this address, Mr. Foster surpassed all his former efforts. He not only drew his inspiration from the barbarism of slavery, but from bonds and imprisonment inflicted upon his own person. From that day on, converts were multiplied daily in the vicinity of Georgetown. So this is kind of the bringing Mr. Foster to town really started kicking things off in Georgetown and changing people's sentiments. And the Essex County Anti-Slavery Society held its annual convention right here in Georgetown in 1841, 1845, and 1851. And during those conventions, we had such well-known abolitionist speakers as William Lloyd Garrison, the previously mentioned Stephen Foster, Thomas Beach, George Thompson, Parker Pillsbury, and former slave Frederick Douglass. A lot of people don't realize that some of these famous guys are right here in town. After Foster's visits in 1841 and the first convention, like I say, things started heating up. A lot more people were getting fired up about the Anti-Slavery Society, and including the come-outers were more people to leave the church. So we start seeing in the church records problems cropping up. In 1842, from the First Congregational Church records, the following vote was passed at a meeting of the church: to have the door of the meeting house, and that's what the church building was called in those days, to have the door of the meeting house bolted and barred against all desperadoes and men going from pillar to post, trying to demolish all order in society, pretending to be anti-slavery men, and accusing ministers and churches of being thieves, robbers, pirates, and adulterers. Pretty nasty stuff. We had and some of what they were doing, you can see why there's so much disruption. You can see by that they want to bolt and bar the doors of the church. These come-outers would stand out on the steps of the church, and they would taunt the people as they're going in. And they would actually disrupt the service. As the minister is up in front of the church preaching, they would barge in the doors and start calling him names and shout accusations at the people in the church because they weren't doing enough to fight slavery. So they were very, very disruptive. And I haven't looked at the records of the other churches here in town, but I imagine they might have been having similar problems too. This is just, like I say, I've only been through the First Congregational records. Well, right in the First Congregational church, there were several members who had become come-outers. And they, of course, stopped attending church. Now, back in the mid-1800s, there was a group named the Vigilance Committee in the church. And it was their duty, when they heard that somebody was sinning, they would investigate. And if they found that the charges were believed to be true, these people would be called in front of the church to answer to the charges. And it would be the decision of the church to forgive them or excommunicate them if they were especially bad. And during this time, there were a bunch of the come-outers all got called before the church. Now, people were called before the church. They had two choices. They could either show up and defend themselves, or they could just choose to stay home and ignore it, in which case they usually got excommunicated. But these guys, they decided they would show up when they were called before the church because they wanted to state their case. And they weren't very nice. So I have a few of the people that showed up and what they said. I had Joseph Noyes. When he answered to charges, he stated that he did not believe the church organization, he did not believe in the church organization or in the authority and sanctity of the Christian Sabbath. Isaac Newton, yes, that was his name, said he did not regard this as a Christian church, but a company of thieves and robbers. And Moses Wright, who was charged along with his wife and his mother-in-law, stated he felt the prevailing influence in the church was the devil. Nasty stuff. So anyhow, not surprisingly, all these people, and there are several others that were called in front too, every one of them was excommunicated in 1842. And they were no longer members of the church. Now, Moses Wright that I mentioned, he's an interesting character because he didn't just cause a little trouble around town. He really practiced what he preached. He was very passionate about the whole anti-slavery movement. He often entertained some of the more famous abolitionists in his town, the ones that I previously mentioned, Frederick Douglass and others. He was also a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And during the Civil War, he was appointed superintendent of freedmen down in South Carolina and was actually working with the freed slaves for a while. He got very sick down there and returned home, and people thought he was going to die. He was just a shadow of his former self, they say. But shortly after, not long after getting home and getting some good Georgetown cooking, he was back to his accustomed weight of 200 pounds. The big guy. Another one of the very active come-outers, and I mentioned it previously with the release of Stephen Foster, was Theodore Eliot. And he also entertained many of the prominent abolitionists in town, and he was also a conductor on the Underground Railroad. And his house is one that you're all familiar with, and you know, surprisingly, there's very little publicity about the fact that this was a station on the Underground Railroad. He lived in what is now the King Davis building right in the square. That was a station on the Underground Railroad. How many people realize that? The come-outers in town continued being a problem for several years, and they show up again in the church records. Now I'll read this one. Voted to adopt the following resolution. This is again at First Congregational Church. Whereas we believe there has been for some years some in our religious society who at heart have been most malignant enemies of divine truth, and believing that the providence of God has placed them of late where their true position may be seen by every man, and that they manifest their readiness to defend the open infidel and laugh and jeer when the church and the ministry are assailed. And whereas a move has been made to rescind a vote by which this church has been closed against a class of men whose business it is to assail and condemn the church and ministry and every true supporter of religious principles, therefore resolved that we will not rescind said vote, but endeavor to do all in our power for the sustaining of the principles of said vote, and to counteract that most deadly influence abroad in this community against Christianity. So they're still, they decided a few years later, we still want to bar the doors of the church and keep these guys out because they're still causing problems. So by 1847, things seem to be simmering down a bit. I guess the come-outers are quieting down, although, they're still out there, but not causing as much problem. But there's still a lot of hard feelings around the town. We have from Reverend Isaac Brayman, was the minister of the Congregational Church for 61 years. And they held a 50th anniversary of his ordination at the church. And he gave a big, long, wonderful address. And in it, he mentions this time and the come-outers, talks a little bit about them. And a certain class of lecturers, mock philanthropists, under the guise of friendship for the slaves and pleading their cause, have done immense mischief in this place, causing unpleasant feelings in the church and society, which it is feared has not wholly subsided, and divisions which are not, perhaps, wholly healed. Some were deceived and led away by them. Others were soon convinced that, however great their love for the slave, the hatred of the church, of the ministry, and of all our religious institutions was much greater. The more prominent among them have since become avowed infidels, renouncing not only the church and the ministry, but the Holy Sabbath, the Bible, civil government, and everything that the true Christian and patriot hold most dear. So you can see this caused a rift in town for a number of years, the whole anti-slavery movement, and particularly the radical come-outers. Now, I have to mention that not everybody in the Anti-Slavery Society was a come-outer. There were a lot of decent church-going people that were opposed to slavery. They weren't all troublemakers like the come-outers were. In 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, and things simmered down considerably in town. Very little from then on really shows up about the anti-slavery movement, although they were still having meetings of the Anti-Slavery Society, but there's just not as much mention of them after that time. And part of that reason might be that they lost one of their leaders. Theodore Eliot and Moses Wright were the two in town that names pop up everywhere in the talk about the anti-slavery movement. And in 1851, Theodore Eliot got gold fever. A little late to be a 49er. He was 2 years late, but that lure of California gold became a little more interesting than working through the slaves. So one of the two big leaders in town decided to leave and headed to California, left his wife and son here, headed to California, and didn't come back for another 7 years. And spent really most of his life going back and forth from California from there. So with one of their big leaders, I think that was part of the reason why things just kind of simmered down. And not too much after that was heard about the anti-slavery, other than they just held regular meetings and discussed it, but weren't as actively involved in things. And that's my talk. Any questions? Yes?
Well, you never mentioned Coffee Dole. How does he fit into the picture?
Doesn't at all. He died long before any of this. He died in 1860.
How did he come here?
Hmm?
How did he arrive here? Somebody import him, or did he?
Oh, he was a slave. He was purchased as a slave when he was a young child.
Purchased as a slave?
Yeah. But he died in 1816, and this movement didn't start till the 1830s. So he was out of the picture before any of this was going on.
And he also fought in the revolution.
Yep, he was a revolutionary soldier, yeah.
Is he the one that was buried over on the edge of the cemetery up here?
And he's right in the center of the
And
cemetery
now it's in the center because the cemetery is growing, and now that's the center of it.
Yep, right in the middle, yep. What's that?
Poetic justice.
Yep. But contrary to popular belief, he was never out of the cemetery. There's an old legend around town that he was buried outside the cemetery. He was inside the cemetery. He was always in the cemetery. He was on the edge of the cemetery. But
He's smack in the center now.
he's right in the center now, yeah.
Yeah.
Was Stephen Foster a famous musician also? Is he famous? Stephen
I don't think
Foster?
it's the same guy.
Was that in 1800?
Could be, I don't know. I haven't found anything about him. This one being a musician, so I don't think it's the same guy.
Well, likely. It would be funny if you were.
Yeah, haven't found anything about that, so I don't think it's the same guy. Anyone else?
Did you see how many of the come-outers there were altogether? In Georgetown?
In Georgetown, no, I found maybe 6 or 8 in the Congregational Church that got excommunicated. I imagine the other churches were probably having similar problems too. So I don't have an actual number, but I know there are a lot more people involved in the Anti-Slavery Society that were not comers. They continued to go to church. They did not come out of their churches. So and this the Anti-Slavery Societies kept splintering because at first it was about the anti-slavery. And then there was the group that wanted to break away from the under-responsive churches. And then there was also a group that decided, along with freeing the slaves, they should also concentrate on women's rights. So they had these different splinter groups, and there was a lot of argument between them of what they stood for. They didn't just stand for anti-slavery, they started splintering off. So there were different types of anti-slavery groups. Like I say, the come-outers were definitely the radical, super left-wing troublemakers.
Can I ask Chris?
Yeah.
If you folks that aren't aware, Chris gives these great cemetery tours, the Union and Harmony Cemetery.
That's a debate that will go on for
There's a
years.
great cast of characters that are buried.
They
in
say
the
it's
cemetery.
down cellar now.
Hold it a second.
Which
He cut the floor.
Yeah.
He cut the floor.
There's a lot of characters that are born and buried in these cemeteries, and you may want to touch base just on a few of them. I thought they were very interesting.
Well, Theodore Elliott is one of the guys on my tour at Union Cemetery and my historical tour, and Moses Wright is on my Harmony Cemetery tour, so I definitely include those guys because I think it is very interesting, and you often hear about the abolitionist movement, and you don't hear about the not so good part of it. You hear the good, that the abolitionists, yes, it was a good thing, we freed the slaves. I don't think many people disagree with that, but they weren't all considered all that good back in their days, and it's a very controversial subject for a lot of people. Yeah.
Is there many more famous people?
Famous, we have Charles Beecher, famous Beecher family, brother of Harry Beecher Stowe. Beecher, yeah, and this, let me get into the Beecher thing first. Charles Beecher, for a while, owned the Brocklebank Museum, and before he moved to Georgetown, he lived in Louisiana for a while. He got to witness firsthand the horrors of slavery. This guy's in my talk. And he was telling his sister about it, some of the things he had seen. And one in particular, he was talking about a man he once met down there, very, very crude man. And this man was bragging about his big fist. He was talking about it. Charles described it as being a fist as big as a hand, big fist. And this man was proud of his big fist because he got it from beating his slaves. And he was bragging about it. And Charles was horrified by this. And this is one of the things he told his sister about. And when his sister, and this partially was some of her inspiration from her famous book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written in 1852. Really got things fired up again. But when she heard the story about this man and the big fist and his bragging, she actually used it in her book. When she describes, if any of you are familiar with the book, the ultimate bad guy in the book is a guy named Simon Legree. And Simon Legree brags about his big fist from beating his slaves. So that is actual inspiration that came directly from Charles, who lived right here in Georgetown and lived at the Brocklebank Museum. And Charles also had a son who was in the Civil War. So we have that tie-in. Of course, we have, I don't know if you guys know, we have at the Brocklebank Museum right now, Georgetown in the Civil War. It's a special exhibit about the people of Georgetown who were involved in the Civil War, men and women. We do have a woman represented there. So, we hope you'll come visit us. Trails and Sales Weekends, the last 2 weekends of September, we have an open house, so it's free. You don't get a guided tour, but you can come in free, look around. The Civil War exhibit is pretty self-explanatory, so you don't really need a tour guide, and we're always happy to answer questions.
This coming Sunday, we do have it open to the public, so if the folks want to come in, and you'll get a tour. We're there from 2 to 5.
2 to 5, yeah. The next few Sundays through Columbus Day, we're open from 2 to 5, and then the two Trails and Sales weekends, 22nd, 23rd, 29th, 30th, I believe it is, we're open 12 to 5 for the open house.
Did the garrison you mentioned have any connection with the famous garrison inn in Newburyport?
I don't know. Could be. It's associated with the report.
Because it made me think that perhaps he did.
Might be.
Same name anyway.
Yeah, could be. I would have to ask them. Anyone else? Anything else you want me to mention it?
No, I think that you've done a super job as the president of the society.
Oh, thank you.
You will see in the, I guess, days ahead, Chris and I did a taping that'll be on Channel 9 of the Union Cemetery. And we've got some great shots, and she was down there actually pointing out some of the specific stones of these individuals. We took some, we had in fact, we're just finishing up, Chris, I don't know if you're aware of that, the last couple of days, they have done their 86 stone restoration. Nothing had been done for about 250 years at the cemetery. A lot of the stones have been covered with moss and lichen and whatever. It was unreadable, so we had a couple specialists who do cemetery restoration, and a number of the stones have been broken. They put in stainless steel pins, adhesive, put those back together, so there's been a lot done. And ultimately, this will go on the town website, so you'll see all 86 stones and before and after pictures of what was repaired. So, we're pretty pleased with that. Thanks to Community Preservation Fund,
Yes,
CPC.
absolutely.
So without that, we wouldn't have been able to do a lot of stuff.
Please,
It was that.
go ahead.
Do you have any of the other locations of the Underground Railway in Georgetown?
The only two that I've found anything about are Moses Wright and Theodore Elliott. There's been question about the Brocklebank Museum.
What about the Kimball House on East Main?
I haven't found anything. I would have to find probably who lived there during that time and see if it was one of the people that was known to be involved as a commoner.
Because I knew the owner at that time. She was elderly, and it was mentioned several times when I was a kid.
A lot of people find holes in their cellar and immediately think it must be Underground Railroad. And there are a lot of other reasons for holes in their cellar. So there's a lot of people who think their houses are and they're not. But what you have to do is find the history of who lived there, find out if they were likely to be involved in the come-outer movement. I have other names of people in town who were come-outers that possibly could have been involved. The only ones that I found any evidence of them being involved in the Underground Railroad in town were Moses Wright and Theodore Elliott. That doesn't mean there weren't others.
Oh, this was refers to the Civil War, I believe it was. There's a flat stone there. I was putting out flags for Veterans Day one time. I had to stop and read it. Big flat stone. It told about this gentleman from Georgetown, and it said that he had been wounded in action in Mississippi and died of his wounds and was buried on the banks of the Mississippi. And the stone is just there, as a commemorative to him. But it's one of those great big flat stones that was engraved. I just have to read it. It was so interesting.
Do you know what the name was? So Theodore Crosby?
I can't remember now. It's been at least 3 or 4 years since I put flags out there.
Wait, which cemetery was that?
On 97.
Okay.
Don't ask me what section it was. I know it was an old section. I just had to stop and put a flag in it.
Okay. Well, I don't know if any of you guys read the Georgetown Record? Anyone?
Yep.
Anyone? Okay, we got.
Oh, yes.
Oh, all right. Well, I do a monthly article. I don't know if you guys are reading it, but I do a monthly article called Georgetown and Civil War.
Yes, I've been reading some of
Yay!
that.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that from someone.
Yeah, I forget the guy's name though.
Yeah, well, I've done several people, but I did, the last one that I did on Solomon Nelson mentioned that very thing where they had to stop along the Mississippi. 3 of the guys died
Yeah.
as they were heading home. and that they had stopped along the banks of the river
Yeah, well, it's
and
stone
buried
right
them.
out there, but I don't ask you what section is there.
And it was
like,
probably one of those guys that they
it's
buried.
near the trees, it's in among the trees, I
Yeah, it was
think.
probably to one of those. There were 3 guys in the group. They died on the way home. They just stopped and buried them along the river. So it was probably
I
one of those.
was amazed that they could take that stone and then carve all the down history of the guy right there.
Yep.
I was on your cemetery tour, very interesting, and I learned something, an article there from Iowa Magazine, how to identify some of the stones you can't read. Spray the stone with shaving cream, and then take a squeegee,
Yep.
and squeegee it off, and it's easier to read.
Yep, I
You've
have
heard of
heard,
that?
I have heard of that method, yeah, although they have, there's some people saying it's not good, so there's something in the shaving cream that isn't good for the stone, so you have to wash it right off, or
Okay.
it can be detrimental. And there's other ways with mirrors, and light, you get the light just right and it casts the shadow, it makes it easier to read, so, yeah.
You know, it mentions something about the stone carvers in Georgetown, because we have at the Union Cemetery some of the most outstanding stone carvers in New England. They're well known, and there's a number of stones that Chris can mention, or the type of design, depending on what time period.
Oh, you're taking me in a totally different direction here, aren't you?
I want to get the Union Cemetery because I think it's so.
You want to talk a little about Union Cemetery, okay. Well, what I love about Union Cemetery is it's kind of a walk through the time of gravestone carvings from the early 1700s, and some of them are still reflective of the styles of the 1600s, right up till fairly modern day. So you go in the very oldest section, and I should have brought pictures. Yeah, if I knew you were going to bring it up, I would have brought pictures. You'll start by seeing what they call the death's heads carvings, which is a skull, often with wings.
Yeah.
And a lot of the very earliest graves around New England have death's head carvings. And then the soul effigy became popular more into the 1700s. What a soul effigy was, it was just a little more attractive. They replaced the skull with a face. And sometimes the face was supposedly made to look like the person. I found somewhere, you know, a very pretty female face with wings. So you can tell, you see something like that, and you say, oh, it's probably a young woman. You look at the dates, and yeah, it is. It was a very pretty young woman at the time. So through most of the 1700s, most of the stones you find are going to have the soul effigies on them. Then around 1800 to 1850, the style changed to willow and urn. Walk through the 1805 section, the section that was purchased in 1805 in the Union, and an awful lot of stones you'll see have the willow and urn. And what they represent, the urn represents the remains of the departed, and the willow represents the living, weeping over the remains and mourning. So that section of the cemetery, the majority of the stones have the willow and urn. And then you get into the 1845, you're getting into more, they find more advanced ways of stone carving and importing stone from other places by the railroad and such stuff. Then you get into really kind of an anything goes. You get all sorts of styles. You get the big obelisks come into play, like Theodore Eliot has one of those, you know, big tall ones. And you get the more fancy carving, you get different types of stone. And unfortunately, you get the beautiful white marble. It's very, very pretty, but it doesn't hold up to New England weather. So a lot of the stones from, you know, the 1850 on, you find these beautiful white marble, and they're really hard to read because the New England weather has just worn them right down. And a few generations, you know, maybe another generation from now, they're not even going to be readable. It's very, very sad. And they're considerably newer than some of these stones from the 1700s are still quite readable.
Can these stones be rehabbed?
We don't know.
There's 500 or thereabouts. This is only at the Union Center. I don't know what they have at home.
And they have a lot of marble ones there.
Yeah.
But probably a good thing would be for somebody, yeah, everybody's going to look at me, to transcribe these marble stones before the writing completely disappears, because it's not going to be readable for a whole lot longer. It's very unfortunate, because they're beautiful stones, but people aren't going to know what they say.
Can they re-engrave them after they transcribe them?
I don't know if that would It costs an awful lot of CPA money, Ed.
Yeah. Well, fantastic job.
Any other questions, guys?
Thank you.
And please come by the Brocklebank Museum. We'd love to see you.
Thank you.
Ed will be assisting me this Sunday. So if you happen to come this Sunday, you'll be able to visit with Ed. He'll walk you through that.
Interesting things that you would never expect, and you know how they lived and what conditions. When you think back during the early period, no electricity, nothing, no running water, refrigeration. What do you do about keeping stuff refrigerated? Things like that. You'll see a lot of the samples of what was available at the time. So, like Chris said, come visit us Sunday.
Thanks, guys. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you, Charlie.
Pretty good.